Okay, it is time to start. Make your way to your seats, please. Hey, Bob, or Chuck, the four muted lights back there that I forgot to hit, the underneath ones. Chuck knows what I'm talking about, I think. Under the counter. There's 4 lights that say mute that are red. They need to be not red. Did he do it? Is it on now? I don't know. You can hear me out of that? Who knows? That doesn't affect the video. Ooh, I do feel like it's on. Okay. There's 1 copy of the notebook at that table, and 1 copy of the notebook at the front table, and 4 copies of the notebook achingly slowly coming out of the printer. So, I don't know, maybe halfway through class somebody could go get those. Anyway, if you need a notebook, there are some available. If not, then you can always find it online. We're going to be at page 59 today. Page 59 in our study of Acts. Acts chapter 15, end of Acts chapter 15, really. They're having like a party in the foyer. I don't know what's going on out there. Or maybe that's the kids' Bible classes that I'm hearing, this din that just is coming. It's okay, Chuck. I don't need to. It'll be fine. I want to plug a couple things before we get into Acts. We have resumed we've resumed some of the midweek, I say midweek, one of them's at the end of the week, studies at people's homes. So the ladies' study is at Pam's house, right, at 9:45 on Thursday. Right, okay. So that's the ladies' study. If you want to go to that, you can. What are you guys studying? Jesus. They're studying Jesus, the most generic topic except for just God, I guess. So if you want to go to that, you can. We have also resumed the Saturday morning men's study. That is Saturday morning at 8 at Lee's house, really his garage, shop, outbuilding, whatever you call it. So that's 8 a.m. on Saturday at Lee's. We are studying love in action. How do we love one another? So if you want to go to either of those, you can. I would encourage you to do so. We have not resumed the Thursday night study yet. I don't know if we will or not, so just be aware of that. I think that's it. That's all I wanted to plug. Acts chapter 15, verse 30. I hope you guys read the related verses because we're going to talk about them. Acts chapter 15. We are continuing through... Of course, last week we talked about the Jerusalem Council, and of course they sent the letter to the churches, right? The Jerusalem Council in chapter 15, they sent the letter about the 4 things they wanted the Gentiles not to do as opposed to the whole law, right? So we'll pick up in Acts chapter 15, verse 30. So when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch, and having gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. When they had read it, they rejoiced because of its encouragement. And Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets, encouraged and strengthened the brothers with many words. And after they had spent some time, they were sent off in peace by the brothers who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord with many others also. So this is sort of a pause. This is interlude maybe. We had Paul's first mission journey in. Let's see, what lesson was that? Did we begin that? That was on page 51. You can see that of Paul's first missionary journey. He establishes a bunch of churches and then comes back to Antioch, has this dispute about the circumcision and about the old law. They go to Jerusalem, they have this conference. And then there seems to be a period of just normal activity. They're preaching, they're teaching, they're encouraging the church. And then they decide, or Paul decides, I don't know. It's hard to know exactly how much is Paul's decision versus the Holy Spirit's decision to go back. To go to visit some more churches. So verse 36. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord." So they're going to check on the churches, essentially, right? Now, Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought it best not to take one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement. Does everybody have sharp disagreement in verse 39? Does anybody have something different? What is a sharp disagreement? Not gentle? Yeah, what would a gentle disagreement be? Yeah, the sort of the agree. Let's just agree to disagree, and it's not really heated. This word, paroxysm, incitement or dispute in anger, to provoke. This is an angry conflict, is what it is between Paul and Barnabas. And there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Okay. When does Mark leave? What is that dispute? Do you guys remember when that happened? When did Mark leave them? Carl? Yeah, does it say why he left? This is an open book test. It's Acts 13:13. You can go and look at it. We're going to read it. Acts 13:13. Now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga and Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. That's all we got, one verse. He left. So why do you think he left? This is on the first missionary trip, right? This is way back. So they're traveling around and around and around, going to all these different places. Mark has joined them. And then they're leaving one town, and Mark just decides to go back to Jerusalem. Why do you think that was? We don't know, ultimately. It's good that you're not answering, because we don't know, I guess. What could we guess, though? If we're having to guess, based on Paul's reaction. Okay? How does Paul react to him leaving? Okay, maybe Paul thought he wasn't doing a good job or he was not needed. Although Paul seems to be angry at Mark, right? Paul is holding this against Mark. He left. We can't take him again. So Paul seems to think that he did not have a good reason to leave the first time. Otherwise, Paul, I don't think, would have this attitude in Acts chapter 15, right? If Paul thought it best, verse 15:38, Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. We don't know why Mark left ultimately, but whatever the reason was, it was not good enough for Paul. Keith? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, maybe he thought something bad was going on. Maybe he just couldn't handle the tension. Maybe he just couldn't handle the pressure. Could be any number of things. Maybe something happened at home, and he's like, I need to get back and help at my home. I don't know. Could be anything, really. Larry? Yes. Yep, could be a sort of judge not lest ye be judged. We don't know what it was. We have to be gracious in our judgments. Ultimately, the more interesting question is not necessarily why Mark left, but the disagreement about over Paul and Barnabas about whether to bring them back again. Their reaction to Mark leaving caused them to separate, right? Paul and Barnabas. They could not agree about Mark. So why do you think Paul didn't want to take Mark the second time? He was disappointed? Obviously, I think Paul was disappointed. He didn't think Mark was trustworthy, right? He couldn't cut it, maybe. This is a very poor example of unity, and I think it's a rare sort of instance in the ministry of Paul or the ministry of the apostles. There's a couple others of real discord between different workers in the kingdom. Why do you think Barnabas did want to take Mark? Barnabas the encourager, right? The son of encouragement. And we do see in several other instances, we'll talk about this in just a minute, where Barnabas gives people the benefit of the doubt, right? He does. He is willing to see the best in others. What's the best example of this? And I'll come back to you, Carl. Yes. Barnabas was the one guy who stood up for Paul when what? Paul went where? To Jerusalem. Paul, the very first time. This is not the Jerusalem Council. This is before that, right? When Paul, actually, let's go to page, we can sort of get the timeline of this better. Page 36 in the notebook. So he's converted on the road to Damascus in 34. He goes into Damascus in Asia for 3 years. And then he goes back so he hasn't been to Jerusalem to meet the other apostles until 3 years after his conversion. He's converted, and then he goes off and he preaches for a while, then he comes back. And in that first meeting in 37, Barnabas is the one that stands up and says, hey, guys, he's converted. Because what does everybody else think about Paul? He's tricking us. He's going to come in here and arrest us all and put us to death. And Barnabas is the one guy who stands up and says, that's not true. He's a changed man. You guys should listen to Paul. That's Barnabas who does that. And then what else does Barnabas do to encourage Paul later? Yes, there's these people, the people that were scattered after the persecution of Stephen, right? In Acts chapter 8, we have some Jews that are scattered throughout the region, and they go preaching, and they seem to start a congregation up in the you can see on the map on page 36, up in Antioch and Sirius. No, it's not Sirius. I'm getting all the names mixed up. In Antioch and Syria and Cilicia and Tarsus, that sort of region. And Barnabas hears about what's going on there, and he's like, I should go get Paul. So he goes and gets Paul in Tarsus, goes over to Antioch, and they start working with the Gentiles instead of just the Jews, right? Now, that brings us back to Acts chapter 15. Paul, go ahead. That's true. Yeah, we'll talk about what happens later on. It's true that it doesn't stop them from doing the work. And we'll talk about how this, I want to keep the timeline as we go through this real quick. So Barnabas defends Paul. Barnabas goes and gets Paul to go to Antioch. It does seem to me a bit that Paul's being a little hypocritical, right? Paul, did he have a good past? No, he did not. He makes some mistakes. Yeah, he did. And you can talk about his intentions, but at the end of the day, he was wrong. And he was killing people. Well, maybe not killing them directly, but casting his vote for them to die, right? So Paul needed somebody to stand up for him, to see the best in him, to support him, which Barnabas did. Then we come to Mark, who makes a mistake apparently, does whatever something he did. We don't know the reason exactly. Paul doesn't like it. And Paul is presented with an opportunity to do for Mark what somebody else did for him, and he doesn't. George? Yeah. Yeah, it could have been, you think about Mark, this is back in the original reason, right? So Mark goes back to Jerusalem, but apparently here he's back in Antioch. So he didn't just hang out in Jerusalem the whole time. This is Mark, right? Mark didn't just hang out. He's back up there to be going to do the work somewhere. And I really think Paul had an opportunity here to do unto others what had been done to him. Now, ultimately, let's read some later verses. Galatians 2, 1 through 5. No, that's not right. That's the wrong set of related verses. 2 Timothy 4. 2 Timothy 4, 9 through 11. This is way later than this. 2 Timothy is written in the 60s. So this is, 20 years, 10 to 15 years later. 2 Timothy is 10 to 15 years after this event. So what does Paul say? 2 Timothy 4:9. Do your best to come to me soon. He's talking to Timothy, right? For Demas is in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. A lot of people deserting Paul here. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for my ministry. Let's read another one. Philemon 23 and 24. You're thinking, where's the chapter? There's only one chapter in Philemon. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. Again, this is much later. And then the final one, 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5, verse 12. By Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. Likewise, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greeting, as does Mark, my son. Greet one another with the kiss of love. Peace to all you who are in Christ. So, how does Mark end up? Very close to Paul and who? And Peter, apparently. Close enough to Peter that it is probable that most of Mark's information in the Gospel of Mark comes from Peter, because it doesn't seem to be that Mark was an eyewitness like the rest of them. So Mark ends up being very useful, apparently. That's Paul's words, right? Very useful in the kingdom. He's a servant, he's a worker, he's doing the right thing. So ultimately, we come to Acts chapter 15. Who was right? Paul or Barnabas? Barnabas was right. He was right. Okay, Barnabas was correct. And it's interesting, the power of an encourager is what we see in these texts. Paul goes to Jerusalem, needs someone to defend him. That's Barnabas. Paul, hanging out in Tarsus all by himself, needs some direction. Barnabas goes and gets him. Brings him to Antioch, which really starts all of the mission journeys, right? Is he being in Antioch because Barnabas got him. Mark maybe got homesick. Maybe there was a disagreement. Ultimately, we don't know. Left the work, went back home. And yet, here came an opportunity to encourage Mark, to direct him in the work. Barnabas does that again. And we know Mark ends up being very productive, very useful, very helpful. Very close, ultimately, to Paul and Peter, even. I do think it bears out Barnabas was correct about Mark. this sharp disagreement. Go ahead. Yes. Yeah, this is a good lesson. We think about personalities, okay? I do, and I'll sort of recap what Don said. Paul had a personality of single-minded determination, right? He just kept going and going. He was like the Energizer Bunny. He just kept going and going and going. We don't get any indication that Paul ever sort of took a break or ever sort of took a day off. He was one of those people, and people like this. They work and they work and they work and they go and they go and they go. And I think that most people are not like that necessarily. So Mark has a very human failing, perhaps, and it's hard to even know if it is a failing because we just don't know the reason. Mark stops doing the work. And I do think what Don says is true. Sometimes when people struggle with things that we personally do not struggle with, it is hard to have mercy, right? Hard to show grace. Because if it's not really a problem for me, I just don't understand how you could have a problem with that. Mark, what are you doing? How are you so weak? You can't keep going? Like, what's going on, Mark? And then, of course, Paul seems to think that he's just not worth taking later on. And I think we have that problem too. When we see people struggling with things that are not really difficult for ourselves, whatever it doesn't have to be this necessarily, but anything it happens to be, it can be very difficult to be understanding about they're different than me and their struggles are different than mine, and I need to be showing them support and grace and helping them. This, I think, is Barnabas' great skill, his gift, the gift of encouragement, right? That's what Barnabas did. And I think if we're thinking about our own role in the kingdom, I think most of us are not going to have the role that Paul had, right? I mean, none of us are going to be an apostle, obviously. But just the role of an evangelist or a preacher or a teacher, we know from other verses in the Bible that that's just, most Christians are not going to do that. We just know that. I do think more Christians could be like Barnabas, right? Could try to see the best in others. Could try to support one another when we make mistakes, maybe. And could look for opportunities for others to serve. Because that's really what Barnabas is doing, right? He's seeing opportunities where somebody needs to help out in some way. And he thinks about somebody that needs to be encouraged that could do that job, whatever it happens to be. We could be doing that. You could be doing that, probably. It takes what? It takes thoughtfulness, purpose, takes consideration. You have to be thinking about your fellow Christians. You have to be thinking about the needs of the church, thinking about things that need to be done and who could possibly do them. I think this is what it means to be an encourager like Barnabas. Any other comments about this story before we move on? Yeah. Yeah, and I do think it definitely is, he didn't think Mark was reliable. I think that's very much true. He just doesn't think Mark's reliable, right? He doesn't think that Mark should go, they should take Mark. And ultimately we know, somebody else said this, I don't remember who exactly said this. Well, maybe it was Don earlier. It does work out in the end, right? It does work out. Paul takes Silas, who incidentally, Silas is also listed in the 1 Peter passage, 1 Peter 5. It's interesting, we have this sort of split about Mark and Silas. And Peter ends up connecting to both of them. Of course, Silas came from where? Where is Silas from? You guys remember? Maybe I'm misremembering this because nobody knows the answer. Yes. Acts chapter 15, 27. He's one of the guys that sent. Silas is one of the guys in Jerusalem, a brother in Jerusalem, who is sent with the letter to sort of vouch for the letter, right? So these are all these things are connecting back together. Mark, who was in Jerusalem for some time, maybe he went with the group too that went from Jerusalem. How did he get back to Antioch? I don't know. We don't know. But we're seeing how these things connect and go back to each other. And ultimately, things did work out, we know. But I would encourage us not to write people off because of their past mistakes. I think that's the main lesson here. Don't write people off just because they made a mistake in the past and you think maybe they're not reliable now. We need to believe in each other, that we can be better, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I do think, we grow. Mark went back to Jerusalem. Maybe he couldn't cut it, but he grew and he learned, and he was with the apostles and the elders in the church in Jerusalem and grew, and that's what we need to believe that people can do. Okay. Spent more time on that than I thought we would, but that's okay. It's a good story. 16, Acts chapter 16. Let's talk another complicated set of stuff. Acts chapter 16, 1 through 5. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. Actually, let's get the flow of this back right. Verse 40 of 15. Paul also chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. What does that mean, having been commended by the brothers? What do you think that means? Who's the brothers? The church. This is very similar to what happens in Acts chapter 13, right? We don't have the same detail of what happened in Acts chapter 13, but the whole idea of the Spirit says to them, set apart from me Paul and Barnabas for the work to which I've called them. This is, I think, a similar thing that's going on, being sort of commissioned or blessed maybe by the church to the work that they're about to do, because this is really the start of the second journey, right? Verse 16:1. Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul, let's talk about brothers for a minute. What are the two different ways that Acts uses the word brothers? I guess there is the third sort of, he literally is a guy's brother, but that's not really what we're talking about. Yeah, one is Jews talking about Jews. Yes. So we have this word brothers, which sometimes means the Jews, that is by race, right? The same race. And sometimes means the Christians, that is the same religion. So it's a little bit interesting when we go through the book of Acts, and we're not going to do this all today, obviously. But it's a little bit interesting to go through to see which one is which, and when they're talking about the Jews and when they're talking about the Christians. Here, again, it's a little bit ambiguous what the brothers means. This Timothy was spoken well of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him. He took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they knew his father was a Greek. And they went on their way through the cities and delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in faith, and they increased in numbers daily. All right. Hold that in your mind. We're going to read all these verses before we talk about these questions. Galatians 2, 1 through 5. These are all the last set of verses in Galatians 2. Or the last set of related scriptures here. So Galatians 2 is the first one. Galatians 2, 1 through 5. This is Paul talking. After 14 years, I went to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus. I went up because of a revelation set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential. The gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring them into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved. What is he saying here? This is, I think, the Jerusalem Council. Titus, who is a Greek, they want him to be circumcised. Why? Because he's not been circumcised, he needs to be in the church. This is the whole point of the Jerusalem Council, right? And one of the things in the letter is, we're not going to trouble you with circumcision, right? That's one of the things. Titus is not forced to be circumcised. Galatians 5, 1 through 6. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. The slavery to what? The old law, right? Look, I, Paul, say to you, if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen away from grace. Through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither the circumcision or uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. And then Acts chapter 21. This will be the last section here, which is not about circumcision necessarily, but is another interesting story. When we came to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles, through his ministry. When they heard it, they glorified God. They said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews who have believed. They are zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children. Is that true? It's hard to say. It is true in the sense, don't circumcise your kids for your relationship with God. It's hard to know if he was saying don't circumcise your kids at all, because circumcision ends up becoming a cultural matter, right? Did he tell them just don't circumcise even as part of your culture? I don't know. It's hard to say, but he is definitely telling them not to be circumcised for their religion. What then is to be done? Verse 22, they will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourselves along with them, and pay their expenses. They may shave their heads. Thus all will know there is nothing in what they have been told about you. But you yourself also live in observance of the law. Does Paul live in observance of the law? It's hard to say. This is a difficult thing. But as the Gentiles who believed, we sent them a letter that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed. We read this letter already, right? Paul took the men the next day, and he purified himself and went to the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and offering presented for each one of them. Okay, put all these together. I don't know how much of those texts you remember. We'll talk about them as we go through. Overall, the first question, throughout all his writings, why did Paul teach that circumcision and the Mosaic law was unnecessary for the Christian? Okay, the Mosaic law was no longer needed to have a relationship with Christ, right? That's the main point of the whole dispute that we've been having so far in Acts. And he says it more specifically in Galatians, right? If you accept circumcision, then what? Christ will be of no benefit to you. He does say severed too, but that particular verse, if you accept circumcision, then Christ will be of no benefit. Which means what? What's the primary benefit of Christ? Salvation, forgiveness, not of any benefit if you're trying to live by the old law. So Paul does teach overall circumcision is unnecessary. It is something that we should not be forced to do. It is not something we should be trying to live by. So overall, throughout all his writings, again, why was requiring others to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law wrong or sinful or dangerous? Yes. and we've read this several times, that imposing one part of the law meant they had to follow all the law. That's what Paul says numerous times. It's dangerous, it's sinful, because you're imposing upon somebody a requirement that God has not made. Does God like it when we do that? No, he does not. So it's dangerous not only for the person who is having to follow the law now, also dangerous for you as a Christian, that you are imposing something that God did not want. So, those are the overall teachings then. So in Galatians 2, why did Paul not have Titus circumcised? That's what he said in Galatians 2. Titus was not circumcised. We did not yield to them even for a moment. Okay? Okay? What do you mean by that? It's all about the church. Okay, so this is an internal matter in the church about what are we going to teach, what needs to be required for salvation. And of course, the whole dispute in the Jerusalem Council is the question of circumcision. Do we need to have the Gentiles be circumcised? And the answer they come to, because of Peter and the business with Cornelius, what's the answer they come to? No, we don't. And so if Titus was going to be circumcised at that particular moment, it would undermine the entire process, the entire disagreement they're having. The decision they make in Acts chapter 15 would entirely be undone if they acquiesced and Titus was circumcised, right? Bob? Absolutely. So you got these false brethren who secretly came in to spy the freedom we have in Christ. What's the freedom? Freedom from what? The old law. Oh man, so thankful for that. So again, really it would undermine the whole argument that Paul and Peter end up making. So then in Acts chapter 16, why is Timothy circumcised? Okay, so why was that not good? Why was that argument not made for Titus? Neither was. So here's the deal. And there's an interesting thing of lineage in here. Titus, who by all accounts is just a regular Gentile dude. Timothy is what? Half Jew, half Gentile. Half Greek is what it says. So now we have the interesting cultural element to this. Right? And this goes back to, again, what circumcision ended up becoming as we go through the book of Acts. Circumcision transitioned from being a religious rite, something that was part of your relationship with God, to being a cultural rite, something that was part of your national identity, right? So when in Acts chapter 21, verse 17, they tell Paul, the Jews are saying, you're teaching everyone not to follow the law of Moses, not to be circumcised. That is true and untrue at the same time. Because it's not like he was never having anybody circumcised, right? He had Timothy go get circumcised. So when it says you're telling everybody not to follow the old law and not to be circumcised, in what sense is that true? As a religious rite, do not be circumcised as part of your relationship with God. But it does seem to be the case that in some instances it was a cultural matter, particularly among the Jews, right? Carl? Say that again, I didn't hear it. Be a little louder. Okay? Yeah, so talking about his habit, he goes to a new town. First place he goes is the synagogue, Now, they're probably not doing circumcision checks. I'm just going to throw that out there at the door. But they might ask, right? They might ask this, are you a Jew? Or have you followed the rites or whatever it happens to be? Or should you be allowed in this assembly? And to be truthful, he does have to have that, right? You can't just lie and say, oh yeah, we're fine, don't worry about it. And it's possible that there's this thing where, because Titus was not half Jew, they just didn't care, right? He's totally not a Jew at all. So maybe the Jews are just not going to care. He's a heathen, whatever. We're not going to listen to him anyway. But Timothy being half Jew, and it's not like his lineage is unknown, right? He's well spoken of by all the brothers. He has a good reputation. People know who he is. So there's two possibilities here. And we're not even done with the topic yet. One possibility is that this is a matter of becoming all things to all men, right? In order that I might win more. The other possibility is that Paul's being inconsistent here. He shouldn't have done this. This is a possibility here. In Acts chapter 21, why did the elders want Paul to participate in the Mosaic vow? To take the heat off, John? Yeah. And it does kind of connect back to what happens with Paul and Barnabas and Mark, right? That idea of seeing the best in others. So when we think about this Mosaic vow in Acts chapter 21, okay, the elders tell Paul, the Jews all think you're teaching them not to obey the law, which is true. So why don't you participate in this vow to do what? To discredit them. Except I do wonder, did that need to be discredited? Because it was kind of true, right? He was teaching them not to participate in the old law. So why did Paul consent to do this vow in Acts chapter 21? Okay? Maybe and there's a value judgment to be made here about what battles are worth fighting in which contexts, right? Perhaps. So you think about, I'm going to go be with a bunch of Jews now. I'm going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be talking mostly to Jews. Which battles are worth fighting in order to enable my ability to preach the gospel? And again, this goes back to the becoming all things to all men. Actually, let's read that. Where is that text? Anybody know? We don't have time. We'll finish this later. We'll finish this, I guess, next week. Find that passage and read it for next week, and we'll finish this discussion. I think there's an important overall lesson to be had, and we'll talk about this as we conclude next week. An overall lesson to be had as we deal with religious things versus cultural things. That's the ultimate discussion that we're having here. And what parts of culture to accept and not to accept in pursuit of teaching the gospel, right? So we'll finish this discussion next week. I have my mask. Yeah, it's right here.